Right now, at this very moment, you are pulling something extraordinary into your lungs. Not air in the simple, boring sense. Not just nitrogen and oxygen the way a chemistry textbook might put it. You are breathing atoms that were once part of a living, breathing, stomping, roaring dinosaur. And I do not mean that loosely. I do not mean it poetically. I mean it in the most rigorous, calculable, physics-backed sense you can imagine. There is a proof for this, and once you see it, you will never take a single breath for granted again. Let us start with what seems like a simple question. What happens to matter when something dies? A dinosaur, say a large one, a sauropod, lumbering through what is now South America 150 million years ago. It eats, it breathes, it pumps blood, it grows to an enormous size. And then it dies. What happens to all those atoms? Every single atom in that animal, every carbon atom in its muscles, every nitrogen atom in its proteins, every oxygen atom dissolved in its blood, every calcium atom locked into those massive bones. Where do they all go? The answer, and this is the beautiful part, is that they go nowhere. They stay here, on Earth. They cycle. Now, the first thing you have to understand deeply, not just accept but really feel in your bones, is that atoms are not destroyed. Ever. Not under any circumstances that occur naturally on this planet. You can burn wood and you get carbon dioxide gas and water vapor and a little ash. But every atom that was in the wood is still around. It just rearranged. It combined with oxygen. It floated into the atmosphere. But it is still there. Still a carbon atom. Still a perfectly intact, unchanged carbon atom. The fire did not destroy it. Nothing on Earth destroys atoms. That is a fact of physics as solid as anything we know. So let us think about what this really means for our dinosaur. When that animal died, decomposers got to work. Bacteria, fungi, all manner of microscopic life began dismantling the complex biological molecules, the proteins and fats and sugars, into simpler compounds. Carbon dioxide got released into the atmosphere. Nitrogen got cycled into the soil. Minerals leached into groundwater. The bones took a bit longer, but they too eventually dissolved or became incorporated into rock. Every atom that was in that dinosaur dispersed into the environment of the Earth. And here is the thing about dispersion on a planetary scale. 150 million years is an almost incomprehensibly long time. For context, if you stacked 150 million playing cards on top of each other, the pile would reach from the Earth to the Moon and back several times over. That is how long those atoms have been wandering around this planet, mixing and remixing, entering organisms and leaving them, rising into the atmosphere and falling back down in rain, being absorbed by plant roots and exhaled by volcanoes and circulated through the oceans. The mixing is the key. And now I want to give you a number, because this is where the physics becomes absolutely concrete. In every breath you take, you inhale roughly 22,000 million molecules of gas. That is 2.2 times 10 to the 22 molecules per breath. Let me write that out so you feel the scale. 22 followed by 21 zeros. That is a mind-bending number of molecules. And each molecule contains atoms. Now here is the calculation that changes everything. The atmosphere of the Earth contains a fixed, finite number of atoms. It is a large number, yes. Roughly 10 to the 44 atoms total in the atmosphere, give or take. But it is finite. And those atoms get shared among every breath that every living creature on Earth takes. Every plant that photosynthesizes. Every ocean that absorbs gas and releases it. Every geological process that off-gasses from rock. All of it is mixing into this finite reservoir. When physicists and chemists run the calculation for something called the Avogadro mixing argument, the result is striking. Given the volume of the atmosphere, the number of atoms in a single breath, the timescale of atmospheric mixing, which is on the order of years to decades for thorough global mixing, and the number of years since a given historical creature lived, the probability that any given breath you take contains at least one atom that was once inside a particular large animal that lived more than a few thousand years ago approaches certainty. Not just high probability, near certainty. You want to see why? Let us think about it more carefully. Take one breath. You inhale roughly 10 to the 22 atoms of gas, mostly nitrogen and oxygen. The entire atmosphere contains roughly 10 to the 44 atoms. So your one breath represents about 1/10 to the 22nd part of the entire atmosphere. In other words, You are sampling about 1/100th of a percent of a percent of a percent, keep going, of the atmosphere with each breath. But here's the trick. That is still a huge number. And our dinosaur, that massive sauropod weighing perhaps 50,000 kilograms, contained on the order of 10 to the 27 atoms in its body. Now, over 150 million years, all of those atoms have dispersed into the atmosphere and biosphere and been recycled through it countless times. The question is, how many of those atoms are now in the atmosphere at any given moment, ready to be breathed in? Carbon, for example, cycles through the atmosphere with a residence time of a few years. Nitrogen cycles more slowly, but over millions of years, it has mixed thoroughly. A reasonable estimate is that a significant fraction, perhaps 10 to the 25 or so, of the atoms originally in a large dinosaur are floating in our atmosphere right now, with the rest locked in ocean sediments, rocks, or biological tissue. 10 to the 25 atoms from that one dinosaur, distributed through 10 to the 44 total atmospheric atoms. The fraction of atmospheric atoms that came from this dinosaur is roughly 10 to the minus 19. Very small fraction. But now take your breath. Your breath samples 10 to the 22 atoms. Multiply 10 to the 22 by 10 to the minus 19, and you get 10 to the 3, which is 1,000. 1,000 atoms in your next breath came from that one particular dinosaur. And that is a conservative estimate. We are talking about one species, one animal, one sauropod. There were millions of dinosaurs. There were trillions of other Mesozoic creatures. There were untold quadrillions of organisms going back billions of years, all of them cycling their atoms through the same shared atmosphere, the same shared biosphere, the same finite reservoir of matter that makes up this planet. So the real question is not whether you are breathing dinosaur atoms. You definitely are. The question is how many, and from how many different organisms, and from how far back in time. And the answer to that is almost too large to think about clearly. Let us go deeper, though, because I think the most interesting physics here is not the calculation, as satisfying as that calculation is. The most interesting part is what it tells us about the nature of matter and identity and continuity. Here is a question that sounds philosophical, but is actually physics. Are you the same person you were 7 years ago? You might have heard that claim before, that the cells in your body are replaced over various timescales. Your red blood cells live about 4 months. The lining of your gut renews itself in days. Your skeleton takes years. In terms of atoms, you are not even mostly the same collection of atoms you were a decade ago. New atoms came in through your food and water and air. Old atoms left through your breath and sweat and other outputs. But this goes further. The atoms that came in to build you, those came from somewhere. The carbon in your most recent meal. Where was that carbon before it was food? It was in a plant, or in an animal that ate a plant. Before that, it was carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, absorbed during photosynthesis. Before that, it was exhaled by some other living thing, or released by a decaying organism, or off-gassed from some volcanic vent. You are a temporary configuration. You are the universe arranging a collection of atoms into the particular shape called you for a particular period of time before those atoms move on to other configurations. And this is where Feynman always liked to zoom out and feel the grandeur of the thing. Because when you truly understand that atoms are conserved, that they cycle and recycle through every living and non-living system on Earth, you realize that your connection to every other thing that has ever lived on this planet is not metaphorical. It is atomic. It is physical. It is real in the hardest, most rigorous sense of that word. There is a specific experiment that demonstrates the mixing even more vividly. Scientists have traced radioactive isotopes released by nuclear tests in the 1950s and found them in the tissues of animals living in the deepest, most remote places on Earth. The Mariana Trench, the Arctic ice, the flesh of whales that had never been near human civilization. The atmosphere does not care about geography. It mixes. It shares. It distributes. And it has been doing this for 4 billion years. Now let us talk about the oxygen in your next breath specifically, because this one is my favorite. Oxygen in the atmosphere has a residence time of a few thousand years before it gets consumed by respiration or combustion or oxidation reactions, and has to be replenished by photosynthesis. So the oxygen you are breathing has been cycling through the biosphere over thousands of years. But here is the thing. Before it became the O2 molecule you just inhaled, it was probably part of a water molecule in some ancient organism. Before that, it might have been bound to a carbon atom in some biological molecule. It has been inside living things before, many times, possibly thousands of times over geological history. And the carbon dioxide you exhale with each breath, that carbon in the CO2 you are releasing right now, that carbon went through a plant that a dinosaur ate. It was metabolized into muscle tissue. It was stored for millions of years in some organic sediment. It was oxidized back into the atmosphere. It went through ferns and bacteria and fish and insects and mammals, and now it is in you, and now you are sending it back out. There is a beautiful circularity to this. Not a mystical circularity, not anything beyond physics, but a circularity that emerges purely from the conservation of matter and the relentless thermodynamic drive of living systems to use and reuse available chemical energy. Let me give you one more piece of the picture, and this is about the scale of time, which I think people genuinely have trouble grasping. 150 million years. Dinosaurs vanished from the large body record around 66 million years ago. That means their atoms have had 66 million years to disperse. And 66 million years is long. How long? The atmospheric mixing time for nitrogen is on the order of 1 million years for thorough global homogenization. So in 66 million years, the nitrogen atoms from dinosaur protein have mixed through the atmosphere approximately 66 times over. They are not concentrated anywhere. They are not in one particular location on the globe. They are evenly, homogeneously, completely distributed across every cubic centimeter of atmosphere on this planet. The same is true of the carbon. The same is true of the sulfur and phosphorus and every other element that was once part of a living Mesozoic animal. So when you take your next breath and you bring in that rush of gas, you are not just breathing air in some generic sense. You are breathing a sample of the entire history of life on Earth. You are breathing atoms that were in dinosaurs and in the first fish that crawled onto land, and in the ancient cyanobacteria that oxygenated this planet 3 billion years ago, and in every generation of every organism that has ever lived and died and returned its atoms to the common pool. Your body is assembled from borrowed pieces, pieces that have a history stretching back to the origin of this solar system, because the atoms themselves are older than Earth. They were forged in stars that died before our sun was born. They collapsed with the solar nebula. They were incorporated into this planet. They have been cycling through geology and biology for billions of years. And for a brief moment, they are assembled into you, thinking these thoughts, processing this information. That is the actual physics of what you are. And I find it hard to understand why anyone would find this idea diminishing, or cold, or mechanical. To me, it is the opposite. When you know that the air you are breathing has been inside dinosaurs, that the water in your cells has cycled through ancient oceans, that the iron in your blood was forged in a stellar explosion billions of years before the Earth existed, this knowledge does not make you smaller. It connects you to a story that is unimaginably larger than any story built on the more limited intuition that you are a separate, isolated, self-contained thing. You are not separate. You are continuous with everything. That is not poetry. That is physics. And the proof is in every breath.